Thank you all for joining us this morning. I see a number of familiar faces and supporters. We appreciate you joining us this morning. Well, the reason why we're gathered today is that we're here to hear the research findings presented by Wellness Initiative on the research that they did, which was around healing on gender-based violence within the South African context, where we were exploring the view of the landscape, examining the barriers, perceptions, and limitations in terms of healing practices or available practices within the South African context. My name is Hazel Damponya, and I'm your facilitator for this morning. So, can you all hear me? Okay, great. So to give you a bit of perspective on the necessity for this particular research, I'm going to read quickly from the abstract, an excerpt from the abstract of the research finding. Just give me a minute. We found it necessary to do this research because South Africa is constantly representing or has been represented within the top 3 countries in the world as its gender-based violence, high gender-based violence rates. Following extreme pressure in 2018, the first presidential summit on gender-based violence was convened in Johannesburg. And it seemed that gender-based violence and femicide had finally received the attention it deserved. As we all know, 2020 was when the pandemic hit. COVID-19 disrupted and delayed the implementation of the government's formal response to gender-based violence and femicide, allowing it to thrive and flourish within the South African context. Currently, gender-based violence is referred to by our President Cyril Ramaphosa as the second pandemic, which means this remains as a severe public health issue and is profoundly undermining the achievement of gender equality, which is a basic human right for everyone. In this study that we've conducted, it revealed a population in extraordinary pain, with extreme limited access to decent helping services and inconsistent policing and justice services. However, it has also provided a wealth of surprising insights into the perceptions of traditional healing methods, the role played by stigma, and the potential of gender-based violence programming aimed at men. So from this research, there are many opportunities that came up, but there are also other interesting findings that raised a number of alarms in terms of our approach to gender-based violence as a society. I'm going to introduce our speakers, but before I introduce my speakers, I just want to lay some house rules. We have the Q&A section open for anybody with questions. Please feel free to post them in the Q&A. We'll make sure that your questions are all attended to. If you would like to present your questions audibly, you're welcome to just raise your hand. We'll allow you, when the time is appropriate, to ask your questions. And you're also welcome to open up your video for us to see who's speaking. Today we have, I would like to introduce our 2 main speakers and our project coordinator. I would like to introduce Tracy Kotzen, who's the CEO of Mental Health and Wellness. There she goes, waving her hand. Just a bit of background on Tracy Kotzen. She has a background in psychology as a counselor, specializing in adult survivor of sexual abuse. Our second speaker today is Kim Ballantyne, who's a research and industrial psychologist. There she goes, raising her hand as well. Kim is an accredited professional business and life coach and a former senior researcher at the Human Science Research Council. And our final guest here is Sehametse Detlale, who's our research field coordinator. There she goes again. She was involved with the research program and is currently our programs coordinator. She will be assisting us with field-related questions within this entire program. I would like to hand over to Tracy to take on the presentation of the findings.
Thank you very much, Hazel. I just want to add to Kim's bio that Kim's also a research and industrial psychologist, in addition to her coaching and her work history with the Human Science Research Council. All right, I'm going to just screen share. Hazel, you'll talk me through whether we have those annoying black blocks that come up on the screen. And
Okay,
tell
so
me what you see.
we have an annoying one on the right-hand side and on the top.
So let's get rid of that one. And then let's get rid of this one. And let's get rid of this one. Tell me now, Hayes.
There's one right in the middle of the slide.
It should be gone now. Yes, good.
To go.
All right. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on research findings. I want to begin by saying that we found a great many things. And so this presentation is a highlight of the findings. So it's somewhat consolidated. And at the end of this presentation, we'll let you know how to get hold of the full research report. So Hazel has covered this extract, and I just want to skip to the bottom section where we have found a population in extraordinary pain with extremely limited access to decent helping services and inconsistent policing and justice services. And that's perhaps not surprising. However, the study provided a wealth of surprising insights into people's perceptions of traditional healing methods, the role played by stigma, and the potential for GBV responsive programming aimed at men. Our methodology was threefold. We ran focus groups in 7 provinces. There were 319 participants, representing 132 organizations, and these resulted in 32 in-person focus group sessions. So the research team traveled through 7 provinces to bring you the study. Simultaneously, we'd conducted a survey. This survey sat in the public domain. We really just wanted to see what is the public's general sense of GBV and healing and barriers and so forth. We had 312 valid responses. And so the survey did underperform. We'd expected more participation in that, but it nonetheless provided some really rich insights. In terms of interviews, these were in-depth interviews with 19 participants representing the social justice sector, community-based organizations, government, faith-based organizations, corporates, and helping professionals. And so in terms of the interviews, we really wanted to diversify the participants and have perspectives from completely different and divergent stakeholders. In total, we had over 20,000 data points, which were then triangulated, compared, and correlated. And the main findings of those are what we would present here today. We focused on 4 areas throughout our research and throughout the 3 methodologies. We wanted to understand what healing means to an individual, what healing means to a community, what barriers to accessing healing services and healing professionals people are encountering, and what required resources exist, particularly at community level, in order to advance healing and helping services programs. In terms of these studies, there were some limitations, and we want to draw your attention to 4 of them in particular. We'd made our survey available in English, Afrikaans, isiZulu, and Sesotho. Most of the responses came through in English. The other 3 languages provided barriers in a sense that there wasn't sufficient uptake of those surveys for us to crunch the data. But we did hold on to the rich insights that came through on the qualitative aspects of the survey. And just a note here, which for us was quite an interesting one, particularly on the Sesotho survey. it seemed that, and so our efforts were to make it available to as many people as possible, and therefore, not leave out certain linguistic or cultural groups. But what we then found was that whereas people are conversational in Sesotho, their home languages, quite often it emerged that the reading of the language was somewhat difficult. And our feedback from participants was that they sometimes had to use Google Translate to actually interpret the question and then respond. And sometimes what then happened was people preferred going across to English, even though isiZulu or Sesotho were their home languages. So that was an interesting limitation for us to discover. The survey, another limitation was that it was circulated through digital channels. And so by default, anyone who didn't have access to the internet or have WhatsApp on their phone were then potentially excluded. And because of that, the survey is not generalizable on its own to the entire population, because we know that a huge segment of the population, and I would go as far as to say particularly rural communities, non-internet connected communities, were excluded. But the survey makes sense when it is looked at alongside the findings from the focus groups and the interviews. And so that's why triangulation was really important for us. Another limitation was an insufficient inclusion or an insufficient deliberate inclusion of migrant and undocumented citizens in the focus groups particularly. That for us emerged later as we thought about future studies and how we can do some examination of how GBV is particularly affecting those population groups. And then there was limited government participation in the interviews. We did have some participation, but not as much as we would have liked. Just very quickly, geographically, the survey was run through all 9 provinces, and you can see response rates. Initially, there were 465 responses with a 67% completion rate. So 312 valid responses in the English survey. Now, I'm going to clarify again. We couldn't use the statistics from the other language group surveys, but we did translate the qualitative responses and incorporated those insights into the overall findings. And so we did not lose those insights, which I think was really important. And there were some really interesting things that came out of certain languages that didn't pop up in others. And we're seeing that as a cultural reflection. And we'll talk more to that in the full research report. In terms of focus groups, the focus groups ran through 7 of the 9 provinces. And what's really important to note here is that it represented 132 distinct organizations. And those were diverse. Faith groups, CBOs, there were pockets of helping professionals, so social workers, psychologists, medical people, the DSD. It was really diverse, and all sorts of different interest groups who are working on GBV in their communities. In the focus groups too, we distributed the focus groups through rural and urban areas so that we would have equal representation of the voices. They were conducted in a mix of languages, and so I would go as far as there was maybe 7 or 8 languages spoken during the focus groups, and all of those were translated, and then thematic analysis conducted on all of them. So we want to look at a couple of the survey responses which were interesting, and then we'll talk to how the 3 come together, the 3 methodologies. So in terms of the surveys, we had 62% being over the age of 36. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that youth between the ages of 18 and 25 were the most underrepresented group at only 5% of respondents. And bearing in mind that we actually distributed this through many different public domains. And so it was just a low uptake. We don't quite understand why, but that is something that we can examine in future studies and perhaps do a specific sampling of youth for the same set of questions, but really to get their specific inputs. That's a potential future study for us. Race representation, in South Africa, we always need to know these things. 58, almost 59% of participants were Black African, and you can see the stats down the side there. 97% of respondents were South African. So we had a very small population of non-South African participants. In terms of gender, again, mostly women, just over 83% were female. We did give people the option of transgendered, male and female, gender non-binary, I prefer not to say, in the spirit of gender inclusivity. What is interesting is that 14% of respondents were male, which I thought was a very interesting stat because it's not something one would perhaps organically think that men would want to respond to such a survey, but they did. And then we asked, what are people's understandings of GBV? And so thematically, this is what emerged, that victims are mostly women and children. It's driven by power differences. Violence can be physical, emotional, sexual, economic, verbal, psychological, and other vulnerable groups can be targeted. Intriguingly, there were a number of respondents who emphasized men as victims of GBV. And this indicates a notable shift in community perceptions around GBV and social messaging, which has been embedded around gender roles and GBV. And furthermore, a lot of mentioning of non-physical abusive acts emerged, such as financial abuse, which also indicates that there's a broader understanding of GBV emerging now. And people are starting to understand that it's not just physical violence or sexual assault. It can actually be embodied in a number of different ways. I want to ask Kim. Kim, there was something that came up around legal abuse, and we were chatting about it this morning. Can you maybe just bring us in on that as well, briefly, please?
Yes, that was a very interesting finding that the people referred to legal abuse. And when we interrogated that, that came out predominantly in the interviews and I think in some of the focus groups. What they indicated was that legal abuse occurred when the GBV went into the justice system, or it was reported at a police station, or actually went the legal route, that the individual who had the finance was the one that could actually sway the justice system. And they then termed that as a form of gender-based violence in the legal abuse arena. So that was a very interesting finding for us, this new term coming in of legal abuse. So whoever basically had the bucks could throw the system. And so justice was not really being served on perpetrators if they had funding. Does that answer the question, Tracy?
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you, Kim. And so here was a really, really interesting finding for us. We had asked participants to indicate if they themselves had been victims of GBV, and we listed the different forms of GBV and invited people to say yes or no. We also asked them if they work in the GBV response sector. So what we find is that over 70% of participants had been victims and or survivors of GBV, and 64% of participants work in the sector. So when we cross-reference those two stats, what we find is that almost 46%, and that's damn near half, of respondents had been victims of GBV and work in the sector. So that really tells us that there's a great need for psychosocial support and healing services, healing programs, healing conversations to happen with the people who work in the sector for their own personal growth and their own personal healing, in as much as we're doing it for beneficiaries. Kim, you had a thought here about the dangers of not offering that sort of service for the people who work in the sector. Can you share that with us?
Yes, absolutely. Because people that are working in the sector, we say that they are working trauma adjacent. So they are holding stories around gender-based violence, abuse, etc. But they've also been abused themselves. So it can be very triggering. And we also find then that when individuals are working trauma adjacent and they're not able to go through their own healing journey or get the support they need, they tend to exit the sector. So what happens is you end up with a high burnout rate, and because of the constant triggering and the re-traumatization of that individual, but you're then also losing this institutional knowledge. So the sector is losing people that they can ill afford to lose. And so when it comes to programming in the sector, the recommendation is really that we provide that type of healing and support for individuals who have been exposed to sexual abuse, so that when they are working trauma adjacent, they're actually getting the kind of support or debriefing or counseling that they need. So I think just to be very aware of that in your programs or in the work that you're doing in this sector in particular.
Thank you, Kim. Just a reminder, if anyone's got questions for Kim or clarity, please drop it in the Q&A, or if you have access to the chat box, you can drop them there as well. And we'll do Q&A towards the end of the session. We asked participants about their perceptions of healing, and now we're starting to look at what was said in the survey and the focus groups and the interviews. And so thematically, there were a couple of things that came out, and we can see this in the color text on the right side of the screen. Personally motivated and owned. Healing is integrating experience into identity. It's empowered by helping services. It's using my experience to help others. It's about forgiveness of self and others, reconnecting with self and others, supported by community, and regaining personal power and autonomy. I also want to invite you to read the quotes, which are on the left-hand side of those color texts, and those quotes are taken directly from the participants. And I really want to just focus on one of these quotes, which I feel like it kind of really embodies this idea of healing. For me, healing from gender-based violence means I am getting my power back from feeling powerless and restoring my enoughness after feeling demoralized and helpless because of the acts done to me. In the gray box at the bottom, it's important for us to note that healing has to be intrinsically, internally motivated. And this seems to be a crucial factor for success. Some respondents identified key outcomes of healing, which we could argue as indicators of a healed individual. These were forgiveness of the self, reclaiming of identity, integration of experience, and utilizing experiences to assist others. For those of us who are developing programming around healing, what's important to know here is that we cannot heal someone. Healing has to be held and owned by the person themselves, and they're opting in to participate in things that enable healing. It is the power that they have. Our power lies in creating those enabling conditions for healing to take place. So it's holding space, it's having great programs, it's practicing really attentive listening, listening with a third ear and seeing with the third eye. But it really has to be the victim themselves, moving from victim to survivor. They themselves are empowered internally to a healing journey. And I think that's important. We can't rescue people, and we can't assume, and I think we sometimes may even do it with a little bit of arrogance, assume that we can heal people. That is not the case. People heal themselves. We create enabling conditions. This was an interesting one when we asked them about the helpfulness of healing practices. So at the start of the study, we asked people to self-identify into being they are victims or not victims. And this comes from a victim perspective. So the interesting ones I've circled around indigenous and traditional healing practices, and then the other one around effective justice responses. And I want to talk to the justice one first. There was a clear division between people thinking justice works really well, very helpful, or not helpful at all. And on deeper examination, it seems that where justice and policing works, it works really well and it is very helpful. But where it is inconsistent and not really working properly in terms of how the system says it should work, not only does its lack of working properly prejudice the victim, it also creates additional harm. And that additional harm comes in the form of secondary victimizations and stigma, which we'll get to in a minute. So when justice works, it works really well. It's great. People are loving it. When it's inconsistent, it's not only inconsistent, it is also damaging. And I'm lumping police and justice into the same category for that one. Under Indigenous and traditional practices, really, really interesting stuff. Most of the respondents found that they were unhelpful. So 49, nearly 50% said Indigenous and traditional practices were helpful, but 36, almost 37% of them said that they were unhelpful. So you can see that there's a really clear sort of polarized view on traditional and Indigenous practices. Looking at the bottom of the gray box, only 5.5% of respondents found it to be helpful in a non-damaging, very helpful, in a non-damaging, very helpful way. So there's a bit of controversy here. Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Is it partially helpful? The jury is out and there's a polarized view. We're going to come to this a little bit later because we did ask some deeper diving questions around this, and we'll get to that on the next slide, on coming slides. What I want to also flag here is that counseling and therapy emerged as the most helpful healing practice according to respondents, and that's going to become very important in a minute. So please remember that. 63% have said counseling and therapy was the most helpful. Other healing practices, which we did not list, but which came out of the qualitative side of the study, was support groups, animal therapy, somatic experiencing, writing and journaling, sound healing, visualization techniques, homeopathy, and breath work. So what emerges is that alternative healing modalities had not found widespread traction, according to most respondents. This could be attributed to a lack of knowledge, accessibility, and cost associated with these interventions. But although these unconventional healing modalities have not garnered similar respect to interventions such as counseling, some victims had found them to be beneficial. So I think what this tells us is that people are looking for healing methodologies. They're looking for options. And they're willing to try several different things and broadening their view of what might be beneficial. And that is starting to emerge. Around perceptions of what is important to various contributing factors for healing, everything we had listed, access to counseling, medical assistance, community support, support of friends and family, freedom to make choices, self-reliance, financial resources, all rated as very, very high. So what this tells us is that the support has to be holistic. It has to come from every possible avenue, personal to the victim, from the system. There has to be money. There has to be an intrinsic drive within the victim to seek help. All of those things are important. So there isn't one factor that is going to be a predictor of healing. It's actually a blend of factors along the victim journey, and so it has to be holistic. When we ask non-victims, they seemed to emphasize systemic things. So an effective justice system, more shelters or places of safety, more empowerment programs, and improved support structures and networks. So victims are focusing on the personal approaches to healing born from direct experience. Non-victims are looking at systemic factors. And when you scrutinize those, you'll also see that those factors speak to both the victim support and prevention outcomes. Another really interesting one is when we look at the community healing and we asked, what would be most helpful to help your community heal? So again, and you see in the red circle, therapy and counseling services is rated most highly and most effectively as something that would help the community heal. Again, we see indigenous and traditional practices providing some controversy. 30% of respondents saying that developments of these could prove very effective, but 21% saying that they're not effective. And in a later slide, you'll see that some people are saying that it's unsafe. And so again, it's polarized. What it tells us is that there's not enough information around indigenous and traditional practices. And so these things are sitting at the fringe, and we don't know enough about them. And people who are referring victims to services don't know enough about traditional practices, don't know if they're safe, and don't know if they're trustworthy. The other thing I want to point out, which is really startling for us, is that over half of respondents here are viewing reform programs for perpetrators as being very effective in helping communities heal. Kim, you had a thought about traditional practices,
yes,
and why there seems to be controversy. Would you just share that with us?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tracy. That was quite an interesting finding. I think it surprised us, but certainly in some of the interviews and some of the data, what came out was the access to Indigenous practices, that people may have to go into areas that they themselves physically felt unsafe, or see someone in an area that, whatever the route that they had to take. So there was that physical sense of lack of security. But the other things that came out that was very interesting was possibly the traditional healers had not had sufficient training in how to deal with GBV, that they themselves had not had sufficient training to make the individual that had been exposed to GBV feel safe within that context. And the other thing that was really interesting was that the traditional practices potentially held fairly stereotypical views around gender, and that could in itself perpetrate the whole perception around gender-based violence and not making it really safe. So those were fairly interesting findings that came out of the research, Tracy.
Thank you very much, Kim. I think that adds so much richness to our understanding of why there is this polarized view.
Yeah.
Right, moving on. When we asked what is available to victims of GBV in their community, so I want to remind you that in a previous question, there was a 63% or so of people saying that counseling is the most effective methodology that they know of in their communities. But here we're seeing only 60% of participants saying that counseling is actually available in their communities. And so this should actually alarm us. If counseling is the most effective thing that people know of, but it's not available in terms of these respondents, it's not available in 40% of their communities, then we have a problem. And so that was really important for us to note, that it's not available everywhere. So we're showing a clear lack of the most necessary services in many South African communities. Half of respondents, however, indicated not knowing about the availability of traditional practitioners, while almost 35% said they were available. So again, there's this polarization coming up. People don't know about traditional practitioners or what they're doing in the GBV space, and some saying they are available, but also flagging they're available. And this is what I wanted to draw your attention to. They're available, but 15% of respondents saying, but they're not safe. So the unsafety issue actually came up for every helping service that we had listed. And you'd think, why is an arts, crafts, and or music option potentially unsafe? What the study was not able to show us is why people think it's unsafe. We only know that there is a degree of unsafety. So perhaps a future exploration is looking into those reasons. Are there physical reasons? Do you have to walk down dark and dangerous places to get to those helping services professionals? Is it stigma? Is it secondary traumatization? We don't know the whys. And so that's a bit of a gap for us, but it again is a potential future exploration. Other healing modalities that might be effective, we were able to cluster these into preventative strategies, empowerment programs, and therapeutic services. There's a very strong pull across all three methodologies where communities are saying, let's localize community-based action. We don't want people to zip in, run a program, and then zip out. It does not empower us as the community. They're asking to be upskilled, their local actors to be upskilled. And when we talk about local actors there, we could actually include the traditional practitioners as being local actors. Can we upskill them to provide appropriate support and training, and then trust the community to deliver effective support to victims and perpetrators? And there's a really, really strong call for empowering communities and then trusting them to do the work. Briefly on the bubbles, preventative strategies are communications campaigns, programs for men, youth-focused programs, and then education on the continuum of sexual violence so that people understand that it's a slow building thing. And then there's a lot of things on that continuum, all things on that continuum, in fact, that are not okay. Empowerment programs such as job creation, skills development, and entrepreneurship, there's a huge call for those. And therapeutic services, particularly community-based support groups, perpetrator reform, and then upskilling local champions. And then there's a really nice quote that I'm going to read, which says, preventative education programs, education around the continuum of sexual violence, and the eradication of structural gender inequality and toxic masculinity, which underpin many harmful and adverse behaviors. And so there was one participant who said this would be their ideal recipe for dealing with GBV at community level and helping communities to heal. Another really nice, interesting finding for us, when we asked people about barriers, and you can see all of the barriers rate fairly highly, we asked about financial constraints, lack of information, distance to services, fear of being judged, safety concerns, cultural or religious factors, and childcare concerns. And the surprising one for us was that fear of being judged emerged as the highest barrier to accessing healing services. So fear of being judged is another name for stigma. So 71, almost 72% of respondents saying that that is the biggest barrier that they've encountered in terms of accessing help. And that is huge. So even if we mass produced psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, counselors, and put them in every corner of the country, stigma would still prevent people from actually accessing those helping services. And so before we can, you should think of it as a bridge, the bridge between the community of victims and the helping services on the other side of the bridge. We can keep sticking helping professionals on the other side, but if the bridge of access is broken and people cannot actually cross over into those helping services, they will remain deeply traumatized and living out all of their dysfunctional and harmful coping mechanisms. The bridge, in my view, is this idea of stigma. We have to tear down the stigma in order to actually build the bridge of access to services. Just creating services is not enough to get people to the help they need. And I'm hoping that makes sense. All of the other constraints were high constraints, and there were no surprises for us there. But the surprise was the fear of being judged. And then the second surprise was this idea of safety. So again, we don't know what is inside the safety. we didn't get enough data. It didn't saturate through where people were describing why it is unsafe. We only know that nearly 70% of people are saying that it is unsafe to access helping professions. So we don't know if that means walking to a taxi rank is unsafe, you have to walk through a dark and overgrown field is unsafe, or the practitioners themselves are unsafe, or secondary victimization is happening. We actually don't know that part. So again, great opportunity for further study. Interesting one. Do you believe perpetrators of GBV should be provided with healing initiatives? The answer was a resounding yes, with over 90% of participants saying yes. And this saturated through on the focus groups and the interviews as well. So across the board, everyone is saying yes. Everyone is saying we cannot heal as a society without addressing perpetration. And Kim, you had some really interesting feedback around why dealing with the perpetrators, even in a victim-centered approach, why dealing with perpetrators is such an important component of whole society healing. Can you fill us in on your thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you, Tracy. I think we all found this extremely encouraging, that although someone might have been a victim of GBV, as we said, 70% in the study, there is this desire for the healing to be provided for perpetrators. And I tell you why it is encouraging, because if you look at the stats within South Africa, 250,000 men or young boys, this is for younger children, they are being sexually abused annually, 200,000 girls being abused annually. So the numbers for men is higher. The number of men that then translate into rapists is about 11%. So that translates into about 27,500 boys each year that potentially become rapists. For the girls, the stat is a lot lower. It's about 6%, which translates into about 13,200. So if we don't look at the perpetrators, if we don't look at those individuals, or bring healing into the sector, specifically on the perpetrator side, we have a really big issue. If, from these stats alone, it's indicating that about 47,000 individuals go on to become perpetrators themselves if we don't bring healing early. So I think the stats for men in adulthood, gender-based violence against them is lower. The stats are higher in younger men. But again, if that healing doesn't occur for individuals as perpetrators, this cycle will perpetuate. Tracy, I don't know if that answers your question sufficiently.
Yeah, Kim, it does. And I'm going to briefly mansplain this to myself because I want to make sure that I understand what you're saying. We're saying that the perpetration for boys and girls in childhood from a sexual violence point of view, it's slightly higher for boys, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, absolutely.
Which translates into 11% of those boys, about 27,000 per annum, grow up to be perpetrators of gender-based violence. And is that including domestic violence and sexual violence and all sorts of GBV?
It really relates to sexual abuse.
Sexual. So 27,000 new sexual abuse perpetrators are being created every year from boy children who don't go through a healing process because we don't have enough services for men. That's what we're saying.
Absolutely.
And by correlation, 13,000 or so female victims become sexual abuse perpetrators in their adulthood.
Yes.
And so if we don't address male healing programs for men, and particularly younger men, it just ends up that we can't actually solve GBV because new perpetrators are being created constantly.
Absolutely. And I think, Tracy, the other frightening thing that didn't come out of our research, but adjacent research, was that men on average will take 23 and a half years before they even talk about what has happened to them, if they do. And in South Africa, we have one of the highest suicide rates amongst men in the world. And so we focus a lot on the female side of gender-based violence, but there is this absolute deep cry that, you know, that's unspoken, that's coming from the male side that we really need to focus on as well.
Thank you, Kim. That's sure. That's actually quite a startling thing. Thank you. Alrighty. Still on the topic of males, well, not males specifically, but in this case, perpetrators. There are very few services available, and with 90% of respondents indicating a desperate need for services. And again, this saturates through all three of our research methodologies. There's an outcry and a desperate need for services for perpetrators, but few participants could specify services being provided exclusively to perpetrators. They could identify things for men, but not for perpetrators, which is a really important distinction. Some noted general counseling services and services in prisons. A few noted support groups for men, but these were not for perpetrators specifically. And just thematically, again, some of the things that emerged were services are needed, but in short supply. Funding shortages for programs for men because the funding seems to be directed into interventions in which women are the beneficiaries and men as both prevention and as therapeutic services are in short supply. There's no funding going to that. Stigma prevents men from speaking out. And as Kim has said, 23 years or longer before men say anything, if they say anything at all. So there could be very, very closeted, very deeply wounded men who are inadvertently, through all sorts of attempts to have dysfunctional coping, end up becoming sexual abuse perpetrators, and also domestic violence. I see that as being, although the stats are not saying that specifically, I see that as a straight line.
Trace?
Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
I think the other thing that came through is that our justice system, our policing is very, it's not an environment where men feel safe at all to report if they have been abused, that they're often mocked. Can't you handle your own masculinity? You're the lucky one. A lot of the posters really are around women. And so it was an interesting thing coming out of the research that men just didn't feel safe at all reporting anything like this. And I actually would love to have Sekha Metsi just comment on some of what came out of the focus groups, particularly in the Eastern Cape and KZN, because there were some interesting findings there. Sekha, are you able to comment?
Yes, I'd like to comment on that, Kim. So the research responses, especially from the KZN, Eastern Cape, as well as in Limpopo, consistently pointed towards a disturbing reality that many men fear that if they speak openly about the experiences of abuse, especially within close-knit families or their communities, they risk being perceived as weak. And one of the primary reasons for this reluctance is the entrenched patriarchal structure in the society or the community they come from, where the concept of masculinity as it stands in these communities emphasizes strength, resilience, and dominance. And men are expected to adhere to the standards to maintain their standing within the family or the community at large, you know. And the display of vulnerability or acknowledging victimhood is often viewed as incompatible with the societal expectations of what it means to be a man. So those are some of the challenges, and there's a lot of reasons, and that's why we see this, the cycle perpetuates, because they don't have a platform where they can openly and speak freely, and they're afraid to express themselves. I don't know if that addresses your question, Kim.
Yes, absolutely. And then, Sekha, some of your findings in KZN.
Yeah.
Particularly on how they dealt with rape.
True. So this applies to especially women as well, or females. In the KZN, there's a theme that came out that, you know, if rape, especially if it happens within a family context, you cannot go and report in informal structures. You cannot go to a police station. Otherwise, it's a disgrace to a family to have stories like that being told. within the community. So you have a discussion with the perpetrator and the victim, sit under a tree, and the family member would facilitate the process where this discussion needs to happen here, and they have to pay either with a goat or a sheep, and that's it. We wrap it up and life carries on as normal. So there is no healing for such victims, because every single day you are in contact, or you're literally living under the same roof with the perpetrator. And you cannot revisit, and it keeps happening over and over again. So most of the victims were saying that, how do you really heal? There is no healing for you in a space like that, where you constantly still in the same environment as a perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lekha.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you. Sure. All right. Yeah, it's very hard to stay in my clinical work brain when we hear that for some people there are really no options.
Tracy,
right.
there's a hand that's being raised. I don't know if you want to take a question.
I cannot see hands, so thank you, Kim, for that. I'm happy to take a question now.
Sorry. Can I just jump in there? Can we please go through the presentation and then have the Q&A later? Because there's a bunch of questions in the queue.
Okay.
All right. Coolness, thanks, Hazel. All right, so sure, to resources. We had asked people to identify the top 3 resources that they believe would be most important to heal from GBV, and considering that at community level. We were then able to, through thematic analysis, able to match, or rather map them into being victim support factors, medical legal factors, and economic factors. And so there aren't terribly many surprises here. Counseling is important, shelters are coming up, free transport services for victims. Under the medical legal factors, there's a real drive for more monies to be spent on certain things. So restorative justice, policing, training of court officials, holding government and legal structures accountable, and then free or additional legal services need to be made available, and more clinics and medical facilities to be built. So this is quite clear, and I think possibly not surprising. What I found intriguing was economic factors, where nearly 33% of respondents are saying that we need job creation. And when you scratch around in the qualitative side as to why people are talking about job creation, there's a really clear recognition that if victims don't have economic empowerment, if they don't have their own sources of income, they're simply financially dependent on a perpetrator. And as Lekha has actually just explained to us, has to then keep going home to that same perpetrator, even if they lay a charge, even if they go to see a therapist, they still have to go home to that same perpetrator, and they can never truly get free. And if they're economically dependent on perpetrators, and they do go lay a charge, or they do go see a therapist, the second the perpetrator finds out that those actions have been taken, the violence actually escalates enormously. And at that point, it starts to be life-threatening violence. People die when perpetrators find out that they've gone to get counseling or gone to lay a charge, or that they're talking about this outside of the home. And where it looks like the victim is starting to try and leave that circumstance, it's really then when it becomes life-threatening. And so it's encouraging for me to see that people are recognizing that their empowerment requires economic empowerment. Their healing requires that. Their freedom requires that. And we cannot continue, we as a sector cannot continue to just look at how are we creating therapeutic interventions without looking at how we're creating economic freedom opportunities for women across the board. And within that is women who are currently living in GBV circumstances. So that, I think, was a really important point for us. In terms of triangulation and further findings, the thematic analysis of the focus groups and interviews, we triangulated all of our findings across all three methods. What we've shared so far is the main findings that are confirmed by the other methodologies. And then there were other significant findings for us to share. There were significant concerns about the lack of available preventative and healing interventions for scholars and youth. There was a clear call for the LGBT plus community and the elderly to have services directed for them. The elderly are targeted with particular violence in physical manifestations of GBV. And, sorry, that was the LGBTQ community and the elderly. But the elderly are then additionally subjected to economic abuse. And then we hear of people's grant monies being stolen, people's pension monies being stolen by oftentimes younger family members who live with them, physically abuse them, sexually abuse them, and steal their money. And that is becoming an increasing sort of narrative. We're hearing more and more of that sort of thing. And then the communities, as we also expressed earlier, there's a really clear call for communities to be recognized as being capable of solving their own problems. And they're saying, give us the correct training and guidance, and then allow us to do community-led initiatives. And we believe that we are then capable of reducing GBV. So the community is saying we can hold our own accountable, but we do need some training and guidance on how to do that safely and effectively. And then in terms of funding, more and innovative funding strategies are required to advance GBV responsive work and to make helping and healing services available in all communities. Now, this was a summary report that we just took you through. There will be a full narrative report that will come available. We're just in the throes of putting the ribbons and bows on that, so that'll come available soon. This report we've just gone through will be available on our mwi.org.za website within 2 or 3 days. It'll also be emailed to everyone who's registered for the webinar, and then the full narrative report will be available on our website as well. If you have questions about the report or anything you want more information on, you can email us at research@mwi.org.za. And of course, none of this would be possible without the participants. So with deep gratitude to the 650 plus participants, representing over 150 organizations across 9 provinces, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and we salute your courage. And with that, I'm going to stop the screen share, and then we'll see about what's happening in the Q&A box. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That was a brilliant presentation. I was most of the time in tears on some of the findings. That interlink between victim and perpetrator and the vicious cycle, and it's something that we've constantly been missing. That brings a lot, that sheds a lot of light in terms of how best we can actually solve this problem. Like the NSP says, it's a whole societal problem. And it's a whole society that has to formulate this, sorry, I forgot the word, has to formulate the remedies for it. It is therefore important that we look at both sides. We are all victims in this when you actually look at it. So for our next session, thank you for everyone that has submitted their questions in the QA. Please continue to submit them. We'll be attending to them right now. I want to hand over to Sekhametsi, who will take us through the Q&A for the next 30 minutes. And if you have, someone had raised their hand, you're welcome to raise your hand and we'll allow you. Laura, I see you. I will start with you. I'll allow you to speak and just ask your questions. And Sekhametsi will take us through the Q&A section. Thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you so much, Kim. Laura, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Ask your question. Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, everybody. So this is Laura Berg, the Chief Enabler from the Greenlight Office speaking. I just wanted to offer an applause for this team. This is extremely important research that we are hearing, and the depth and the authenticity of the data and of the insights that have come through are very, very powerful and very, very much needed. And I thank you for going as deep as you did and as wide as you did on the subject matter. It's extremely important for us at the Greenlight office to have this information. It gives us a level of understanding when we hear feedback from families that sometimes can be a little hard to explain. And you really have pushed deep and far. And I just want to say thank you for this very brave and courageous work.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your kind feedback. I don't know if you have anything to say, Tracy or Kim or Seha.
I mean, look, it's taken us a good almost 2 years to build the research and then take it to the field and then do all of the analytics. And for 2 years, we've been working on it. But I will say that when we were going through the final report and then extracting from that to consolidate the report that we've shared today, there were points at which I had to put the report down and go and, I call them a come to Jesus moment, and just go and have a moment with myself in my garden and just breathe, because it hits you again and again. You can't look at this, and maybe some people can, but I can't look at these things and just go, 70% of people and statistics. And for me, it's human beings, right? There are families, there are mums and dads and children and grandparents. There are families who are living in this reality. And for the people who don't know this about me, this is close to my heart because my grandfather was a textbook pedophile. And so this business of intergenerational sexual abuse and the implications of that is a lived reality for me. I still live in the consequences of the intergenerational nature of that for my own. I still live it to this day. And so it's really hard to just see statistics and forget that there are human beings on the other side of this, and human beings in tremendous, tremendous pain. And those people are relying on people like us and people not in the room, and the hundreds of thousands of people, hopefully, in the country who are trying to do this work. So I just want to say, Laura, thank you for appreciating that we took this to depth. We cried a lot in the process. We debriefed a lot as a team in the process. And we needed to take it to depth because the answers need to happen at depth. We can't have programs that touch on the surface of things and then we can tick a box and say, we did a study, and we can talk about programs and make recommendations. If the work doesn't happen at depth, then we have failed every single one of those men, women, and children. And I'm not prepared to attach myself, my name, my brand, or MWI to any work that is not prepared to do depth work, because that's where the changes must happen. So thanks, Laura, for recognizing that is where we took it.
And I think just to add to that, Tracy, I think our field researchers that held the focus groups, and Seha being one of them, Lebo assisting, and Bonnie, they, we did a lot of the work with the interviews. We obviously worked a lot with the qualitative data, but they were front facing.
Yeah.
And I think we owe such a deep depth of gratitude to them because they had to hold the stories. And, I think, it was tough. It was very tough going through the qualitative research, and because we literally went line by line by line, everything that came in terms of analyzing and looking at the data. And I was saying to Tracy, it's so difficult, at what point do you say this research, the short research we've put out is enough? Because there's so many comments and qualitative information that is incredibly, it's heartbreaking, but it's also very, very insightful into the depth of the issues that we're facing. And I think that's also been the difficult side for us. Where do we call the line on this? But thank you, Laura, very much. Somebody asked just where they can get the stats that I quoted. Our second collective action magazine. Hazel, you can maybe just put the link in the chat, or I can quickly do it in the Q&A. It's got Martin Pelders. We interviewed him. He runs Matrix Men. So he works a lot. He's one of the few organizations that works with men that are survivors of GBV. And it relates to a lot of the research they've done.
Thank you so much, Kim. Tracy, that was emotional. This was second, it feels like secondary traumatization. But thank you. I will share the link. Kim, you're welcome to also share the link to anybody that has asked. Seha, before we open up the polls, I just want to allow those that have put up their hands so that we can just allow them to ask the questions. Then you can continue. All right, thanks. Maria Korean, you've raised your hand. Would you like to make a comment or ask your question? Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to echo Laura's comment just to say this is a remarkably important study, and especially from a prevention perspective. So Laura and Kim, I'm going to urge Pillar 2 to reach out, because the findings that you have are so important in terms of looking at the kind of interventions that that are reaching where the need really is, according to what survivors require. Yeah, this is absolutely pivotal in that. And I think a big surprise for me is the statistics about the number of boy-child survivors or victims. And that, I know you said it is not generalizable, but I think it's worth a conversation to just look whether it's province heavy, because that stat on its own, I think, will be a very surprising one and will have big implications for when considering prevention and prevention intervention. So just on those 2 points to say, absolutely stunning study. I can only imagine how difficult it was, and you know, thank you to the whole team, especially the field workers. And all of this is going to have really important implications as we look at the prevention strategy going forward. So thank you, and I will ask Pillar 2 to reach out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks, Maria. Sorry, Hazel, can I just respond to Maria as well? Maria, the study around the lifetime prevalence of sexual abuse between boys and girls is a study conducted by UCT. We reference it because it became part of our literature review and our grounding for this work. So we can pull that study, and I think now Louise is asking the same question in the chat. So we can actually pull that study and link it directly. So I have contact with both of you directly, and I can pull that study and send it across so that you've got the actual source material around that study. And that was done over 3 years and over 10,000 participants. So it's a really reliable study to base prevention work on.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tracy, for responding. Bongani Makaya, I saw your hand up. Can we come back to you once we're done with the questions in the Q&A? Seha, over to you.
Thank you, Hazel. I'll go through the questions one at a time so that I can give our presenters a chance to respond. And myself and Hazel, you also welcome to respond to some of the questions where you're able to. So we've got a first question from Mante Chandiamba saying, hi, not sure if you covered the economic status of people interviewed. I'd give that to Tracy. Tracy, would you be able to respond to that for us?
Sure. So people that we interviewed are people who are, they're employed people. They're mostly city dwellers, and they work or have an interest in GBV, but they come from different sectors. In the focus groups, it was very mixed. The focus groups we had some rural and some urban ones. and there were victims, and there were people who work in victim response participating in the focus group. So the focus groups are much more representative of people from different economic sectors, but the interviews were from people who have some role, some position of power, some position of influence in the GBV response space. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for that, Tracy.
Sorry, can I perhaps ask the person who submitted that question, what do they mean by economic stature? What were they referring to?
Okay. Hi, Mante. Hi, Mante, are you still on the call? Yes, Mante is here. She's got her hand raised. Hazel, can you allow her to speak? Because she's muted on her side.
Hello?
Yes.
Unmute.
Hi, Mante.
Can you hear me? Can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes.
Hi,
Yes.
everyone. No, I was just, my question really was focused around whether most people who are experiencing GBV, is it because some they're reliant on financial support from their spouses, and therefore hence they are stuck in that kind of a situation. So that's what I meant. So I just wanted to check whether did the research also go through areas like maybe in suburbs, in gated communities where women, even there, some of them are being abused, but you know, and nobody knows about it. So yeah, that's what I was trying to establish. I was just trying to establish whether mainly GBV is concentrated mainly around communities where those women are just stuck because they have no other financial means of being on their own, of being able to run away from the environment. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thank you, Mante. Tracy or Kim, would you like to take that question?
Go ahead. It's fine.
Thanks, Kim. So we didn't specifically look at whether gated communities or enclosed communities would be different. So that would have been outside of the scope of the study. But across the board, there is clarity that people are frequently trapped because they don't have economic empowerment to their own sources of income. But we did not break that down for certain types of communities. I will tell you that in Gauteng, in fact, across the study, we try to focus on what is called the hotspots in order to try and get some deep diving data on that. So by virtue of the design, we were not necessarily looking to see what's happening in middle class, suburban, you know, traditionally white communities, because we're trying to see how do we save lives in the hotspots. So not to ignore the other parts of the country, of course, but every study has got its limitations of scope. And so we didn't specifically look at that. But across the board, we know if women are unemployed, they're at higher risk, and they're trapped. That much we know.
And I think
Okay,
just to add to that, you know, we talked about the people, you know, not practicing healing practices. I think one of the concerns is that if they do access a healing practice, or you know, whether it's a traditional healer or a counselor, if that confidentiality is broken and that information gets back to the perpetrator, what is going to be the impact on them? So that whole sense of safety and potentially economic backlash is definitely there. So as Tracy said, we never looked at specific economic groupings in this, but definitely what came through was the impact that people are held trapped in abusive relationships because of their inability to break free financially or economically.
All right. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Tracy. Amanda has acknowledged the response in the comments. Our next question is from Jabulo Banda. And we've got 3 questions. So I will read through all the questions and I'll give them to our presenters to respond before we move on to the next one. Jabulo says, hi, everyone. Jabulo Banda from University of Johannesburg. And the first question is, could legal abuse also be likened to power abuse, where a perpetrator chances of either getting reported or convicted depends on their position in family, breadwinner, community leader, pastor, politician, and society? I think this also correlates to the previous question that we just asked. Kim, would you respond to that question?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the answer is definitely, you know, that legal abuse, it relates to power. If you have the standing in the community, if you have the income or the money to throw the system, that will translate into some form of legal abuse. So definitely. And I think if you are the breadwinner, if you are a community leader or politician, the clout is there. And again, it sits with who do you believe? And someone in a position of power often will then be able to sway the decision making in terms of justice. Tracy, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I agree. Completely agree with you, Kim.
All right, thanks, Kim. Jabulo's second question is, did professionals' own experience with abuse either assist or diminish professional view of their ability to assist clients?
Repeat that for me, Seha, please.
Did professionals' own experience with abuse either assist or diminish the professional's view of their ability to assist the clients?
It's a good question, which we didn't ask in the study. So we didn't ask that question because I don't think we even anticipated that correlation would come up. I wanted to include that question out of almost just curiosity to see if people who identify as victims versus people who don't respond, have different perceptions of healing. And then it was almost a last minute addition to the question to ask whether they work in the sector. And I included that, and I will confess in this room of safety, I will confess that was a gut instinct for me, that I wanted to know just on my own, because I had my own suspicions about whether there's, because I've been suspicious for a while that there's a lot of people who work in the sector that are GBV survivors, but I couldn't prove it. So I popped that question in just almost to satisfy my own curiosity, but what has come out of it has been so astounding. So there were no more questions about that. I simply wanted to see if there was a distinction. So Jabula, the answer is we do not know. What we do know, and this is probably more anecdotal than scientific, what I'm about to say, just from working in this space, is that when people are not doing their own healing work, they can inadvertently do more harm than good to the very people they're trying to help. And because of the constant triggering of their own stuff when they're dealing with their beneficiaries, makes it very difficult for them to actually separate church and state, separate my client's stuff from my stuff and find a place of peace and healing in themselves and in their environments, because it's bombarded all the time. So instinct for me and history as someone who works in the therapeutic space, and Kim shares this view, is that they're not effective to the degree that they could be effective if, and it's a big if they're not on a healing journey themselves, if they're simply suppressing and ignoring, and they have a narrative in their heads of, oh, it happened 35 years ago, I need to just be over it and get on with my life. If that's the narrative, then I can tell you now, it's hurting their professional practice and not helping. It's much more helpful to admit that this was my own struggle. I'm kind of still going through the healing process and stuff's going to come up for me, because then it allows them to put the safety mechanisms in place and to get counseling and coaching, which will make them better at their jobs than trying to kind of suppress that it happened in the first place. Kim, I don't know if you've got anything to add there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if one has been a victim of gender-based violence, I think you have insight into what the impact is psychologically, etc. And I think that can be beneficial in a therapeutic setting if you've done your own healing work. So I think very much, we didn't specifically look into that. That would be a very interesting study on its own. But I think, in a coaching or any kind of psychological intervention setting, or where you're working in the space, you should be getting your own input. I know as a coach, we have supervision and things regularly because clients do trigger you. And so if you have been someone that has experienced gender-based violence and you're working trauma adjacent, if you are not accountable to someone else or getting therapeutic input yourself, you're going to end up hemorrhaging over your own clients, or your own journey is going to impact them, whether it's in overshare or whatever. So we really encourage that if you are working in the sector, that you're constantly checking in and getting assistance on your own journey of healing. Otherwise, it can be detrimental in this context.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Tracy, for answering that question.
But can I just add on something?
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add on something? It's an important question that Jabulo answered, and I agree completely with Tracy and Kim. However, just of noting, it's not necessarily a response to this. I had the pleasure to be a part of the research in one of the locations, and something that came up was more of the fact that those that have been part of the gender-based violence journey themselves, they've been victims themselves and have become professionals. What lacked was the professional side, and hence what Tracy was talking about, them going through psychosocial support and upskilling as well to assist victims. I think that was something that was important that came out from the research.
It's just a comment. The other thing, Hazel, that came out that was very important was that when people are able to find meaning out of their own story, when they are able to either help other victims or find a sense of meaning, purpose and meaning out of what has happened, that their journey is able to help others, it really accelerates their own healing journey. So, in terms of Jabulo's question, it's a both and. It's so beneficial, but you need the support, and also part of your own healing comes from being able to share and assist others that are going through the same experience.
Thank you so much. That was a very rich response. Hoping, Jabulo, that answered your question. And on question 3, and Jabulo had asked say that I know you have explained the limitations about the sample. However, I'm wondering why you did not, if in this case, set up targets per age group, just so that the sample is more representative in terms of age and even sex. I think this question was directed to Tracy, the presentation, when we were going through the presentation. Could you answer that, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Jabulo, there was so much debate internally for us as to how we wanted to best address the research question. So if you look back at the research question, we were trying to understand perceptions of healing, but to get some insight from both a victim side and also the service provider. So in the focus groups, we were targeting organizations that provide GBV responsive services in their local communities. And we targeted the organizations because we recognized that if you had one organization who potentially represented 50 or 60 or 100 beneficiaries, and they could give you a consolidated view of what they see, then we could actually be having inputs from indirectly having representation of hundreds of thousands of people. If you think about each of those organizations holding a pool of their beneficiaries and then bringing their lived experiences to the conversation. We didn't target victims for this specifically because we wanted to understand it from the lens of the service professionals in that space. Having said that, we had some victims in the room as well. So we do have some of that lens in. So it was just the design of the research and the question we were trying to specifically answer that required us to work with organizations and not individuals from specific age groups, because this was exploratory, right? So now that we have explored and we have some answers, future studies would look particularly at youth. I'm very interested to see what youth are thinking, because they didn't organically show up in the survey. And so it allows us now to do specific deeper dives into certain age groups, and also elderly and also LGBTQI, where there was not organically a lot of representation. We can dive deeper in those spaces. Hope I'm answering your question.
Thanks for the response, Tracy. The next it's not a question from Laura, it was a comment saying that unsafe could relate to worries about confidentiality. And I think that stands really true, Laura. Absolutely. And just before we carry on, I just wanted to ask Hazel, how are we doing on our time? Before I carry on with my questions, I still have about 30 more questions to go through.
We have 30 more questions.
Yes.
And 2 more minutes.
We can add another 10 minutes. So if once we're responding to the questions, can we get to the point and be quick in our response? What we've done is we've curated these questions, and we can respond to these questions to our participants via email. Is that okay with my panelists?
That's fine with me. I think I'd rather respect the time of the participants and not go over time, but we can collate those and respond on email and send them back out to everyone.
Okay, so, thank you, Hazel.
Just additional 10 minutes and then we close.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we've got a question from Nolutando Nzimande, where she's asking whether researchers are able to reach the Traditional Leaders Council to find out if they offer a course in counseling, if they offer a course in counseling and therapy. This council can be very useful in introducing mental and emotional healing to the population that uses this line of medicating and coping. I would take that, Tracy, especially with the focus groups. There's 2 specifically that we did in the Free States and in the KZN, where we actually had traditional leaders attending the focus group sessions. And it was really heartwarming to see the commitment that they have, because some of them are actually sitting on the forums that deal with GBV. So it was just really amazing to see the dedication and the kind of work that they do in the communities, and actually have them drive some of the campaigns that are happening within the communities. So yes, that is happening. We picked that up in 2 of the focus group sessions that I personally attended. So it did come out through the research. And I've got another comment from Jabulo Banda, where she says, I agree with Secha about the KZN healing she just described. That practice is huge. Not only does it deprive the victims of healing, it forces them and others around them to not assist because they are forced to treat the matter as resolved, and that is okay. In fact, that goat or sacrificial animal is meant to cleanse the disgrace and kind of appease the ancestors who would have been angered by the unusual act. That stands out to be very true, Njabulo. Thank you for your comment. Nolutando's other question says, we are seeing a rise in reported rape cases with male, in brackets, boys, victims in one of the rural areas we work in the Eastern Cape, Matatiele. Are other stakeholders experiencing the same? If so, how has the system and community responded to these cases? Trace, Kim, would you like to respond to that?
Wanna go for it, Kim?
Yeah, I don't know if Martin Pelders is on the call, and I would almost want to refer them to Martin and to Matrix men, because they deal particularly with boys and male survivors of gender-based violence and rape. And I think from their perspective, there has been an increase. And I know that Siki and places like that are hotspots for this, but that, I think Martin would probably be the best place to answer that. Tracy, I don't know if you want to add.
No, I would have said something similar. Also, the men's forums, which I know are dotted around the country, are a good starting point for any programmatic things for men and boys.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Tracy. And some of the questions will still be answered via email to the participants, like Hazel had said. So I will just take one more question. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and we will definitely revert back to our participants. As Hazel has indicated, we'll collate all the questions. Tandla Sangwani asked that what is being done to close the gap in understanding and bringing indigenous and traditional practice on board as an alternative in this space? Would not vetting, standardizing, and possibly accrediting practitioners help in lessening the stigma? Surely there are also female indigenous and traditional practitioners who are empathetic to female victims out there, ones who can put patriarchy, sexism, and even misogyny in check. Trace, would you take that?
I was going to suggest you do.
I was also going to suggest you take that, Sekha, because you dealt specifically with the traditional healers.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Well, what we picked up during the research was that there's a lot of, especially with regards to the stigma, young people are open to the idea of consulting with traditional healers when it comes to mental health, or even with GBV. However, they are not openly able to speak out about it or be, especially towards the families, because there's this stigma and they hold back a lot. Most of the families are religion-based, especially Christianity. They are not allowed to express themselves and explore that side of traditional healing. It's an ongoing debate, because we're starting to see more and more young people being comfortable with expressing themselves and displaying their culture proudly. So, so hasn't been a lot, but there's a huge space and opportunity to advocate in this space for traditional practitioners. And I believe with work that still needs to be done on the ground, there's an opportunity that we can be able to close that gap with time. There's interesting conversations that we can still have because of limitations of our time. But I don't know, Tracy, there's conversations that we've also had around the same topic. I don't know if you just want to add on that, and we will hand over back to Hazel to close off.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Sekha. So this will also be in my closing comment. So I'm also like scanning through the questions, and there's a number of questions that I think will be covered by this. So now that we know that stigma is the biggest barrier, and we need to be mindful that this is a limited study with limited sampling, but it's giving us profound insights nonetheless. And so if a lot of the stigma emerges from patriarchal concepts that are held in traditional and also religious faith-based belief systems, also hold those patriarchal concepts which advance this idea of stigma, then certainly onboarding traditional leadership and traditional healers and traditional practitioners into broader GBV awareness and responsible responding, response-able, Laura, you will love that I said that, response-able responding. So not just responding, not just reacting, but reacting mindfully, with purpose and with real understanding and real awareness. Then we can start to reduce stigma. So I think that is absolute, and the fact that there's a polarized view that's emerged around traditional healers within the research tells us that there's so much more work to be done in terms of onboarding them into the work. Because often that is the closest person that one could potentially go to. Instead of having to take a taxi to the clinic that's 50 kilometers away, there could be a traditional, healer in the road, 2 roads down that you could go see, where it might be much more affordable. But at the moment, we don't know enough about how they practice. We don't know enough about the responsibility of the way they practice. We don't know enough about their concepts of patriarchy. And so there's an opportunity for us to upskill and train. But I want to say this about upskill and training. We must be careful that we don't come with colonialist thinking, that we're going to go there and tell them how it should be done. I think that has hurt our nation plenty. We need to go there and ask them, what do they know about how it could be done that they have found is helpful and beneficial, and have the learning go both ways. Right? We can't just show up and tell traditional healers, oh, this is what we know about how it must be done, and so therefore you must now do it our way. I think it hurts the framework of having intrinsic African wisdoms that are good and pure and healthy. And we need to be open to learning about those things and looking how we meld Western concepts of healing with our traditional African concepts of healing, and find something that sits in the middle where both of these find expression for the benefit of victims, communities, and families. It's not one way or the other. In my head, it's a merge of the two where both views are really respected. So I'm hoping that answers that. And then someone had commented about recommendations. Recommendations are going to be available in the full report. There's loads of recommendations, and we're going to a little bit of depth around those. So please look out for the full report, which we'll also be emailing to everyone and will be on the website. And recommendations for policy, in fact, implications for policy and recommendations for programming are both contained in the full report, which we will make available. And that's the end of my comment for today. And I want to thank everyone for participating. It's been a 2-year journey for us. Loads and loads of tears, loads and loads of frustrations, loads and loads of, oh my God, why are we doing this? This is soul destroying to hear these people's responses. We went through the whole 5 stages, 10 stages of grief. But I'm deeply grateful for my team, the researchers, Bonisile Kamanyane, Lebohang Muki, Sekhamet Siditlale. They went out into the field. Hazel supported them as the head of communications and media. Kim provided beautiful oversight and guidance, and I just nagged everyone to death about when the hell are we going to meet the deadlines. But a phenomenal team, and I'm super, super grateful. And we could not have done this without this really powerful team at MWI. And I'm hoping that what we have found here is going to have influence in the way people are thinking about programming, thinking about healing. And if I have one nugget to close with, it would be, we must remember that we cannot make people heal. We can create the enabling conditions for healing, but healing is deeply personal. Every journey is their own journey, and we cannot dictate what that must be. So we sit here as curious and interested and invested and loving partners to come along someone's healing journey. And if we can keep seeing ourselves as that, then we automatically become more effective in the work we're already doing. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
There's just one last thing, just to thank Nikki and the Ford Fund, Nikki Raw and the Ford Foundation for their financial
Nikki
support.
LaRue. Let's not thank the wrong Nikki.
Nikki Nikki Raw. Sorry, I'm so sorry. I just saw Nikki Raw saying thank you for the insightful session. I'm so sorry. But to Nikki and the Ford Foundation, just to say thank you so much. And Nikki Raw, I'm so glad you're on the call.
Indeed.
Right. Thank you so much, Tracy, for your closing remark. And Kim, I just wanted to ask if you have any closing remarks, just a quick, very quick closing.
Yes, I think for me, the big thing was the stigma, that stigma is such a barrier to healing. And I was very encouraged recently. The faith-based community put together a conference. They must have had about 450 pastors. It was called Made Whole. And the main topic was this whole thing around mental health and healing and destigmatizing it. And I was just so encouraged. So I think just so much more of that, every community, you know, that we look at it, that we confront it, because we can put things in place, we can put structures in place, but unless we deal with the stigma, people are not going to access healing modalities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Just to echo Tracy's words, I would like to thank, we are closing now. Would like to thank the MWI team for putting your weight behind this, our board. As Kim mentioned, this research is actually powered, funded by the Ford Foundation. Our hearts out and our most gratitude goes out to Ford Foundation and all the stakeholders that were involved and individuals involved within the research program throughout research project throughout South Africa, through the 7 provinces that we went to. We would like to thank you for your support. Thank you everyone else that has attended. We appreciate your feedback. Seeing a lot of comments and praises on this research. And for those whose questions we have not responded to, we will respond via email. And we will send this presentation and the final report to all our participants. Thank you again for taking your time out. We wish you all the best, and please be in touch on the way, and we will communicate the way forward. Thank you so much.
Sorry, Secha has a hand quickly before we all run off.
Yes, I just received a few requests to share the link to the recording as well.
Yes.
So I just wanted to mention that the recording will also send the link for the recording to all the participants.
To all the participants.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thank
Great
you, everybody.
stuff.
Thank you to the
Thank you,
panel.
everyone. Take
Thank
care.
you. Bye.
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 Please stay, MWIs.